Well, as you may have heard in the last hour, the United Nations climate report paints a very bleak picture of the future if we don't take urgent action to address global warming. If we don't cut back the burning of fossil fuels and fast, we're in for a very hostile environment to live in. Activist and editor of the Maverick Citizen, Mark Heywood, has written about this today, and he joins me now. Hello, Mark. Always great to chat to you. Give us your response to the sixth assessment report of this intergovernmental panel on climate change. How much worse was it than you expected?
Good evening, Sally. Look, I guess I expected it to be bad because the world and governments and all of us have not been heeding the warnings of scientists about global heating and the driving of climate change for the last decade. So it was almost inevitable that this new scientific report, which is a scientific report based upon the studies of hundreds of scientists all over the world, would really find what is becoming more and more evident to us, what we witness on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we just need to think, Sally, of the fires that we are seeing in many parts of Europe, in Athens, in Turkey, in Italy, the fires in parts of the United States, the reports that we're seeing about melting glaciers. Climate change is very much present, and what this report says is that it's going to get much worse, and it's going to get much worse, particularly in our region where we are vulnerable to a 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperature in the next by the middle of this century. But what the report does is it says, or what it does and ought to say to us, is that if we act now and if we act seriously enough, we can still mitigate some of the worst effect. We might be able to avoid some of the tipping points. I'm very frightened by it, and that's what I said in my article.
Yeah.
I said that, you know, if I was a parent of young children, I would be scared for the children that I'm bringing into this world at the moment, because the next few decades are going to be very rough.
What do you make of the political will in South Africa? Because it has to be driven also by political will. Science is one thing, and the climatologist I spoke to in the last hour did say that there is a commitment in South Africa to make changes. I'm just wondering if we're doing enough, though. I mean, we're sitting now with Medupe, with one unit that's just blown up. It's a coal-fired power station. We put a lot of money into that. Do you think that we are going to be bold enough to make the right decisions?
I don't. As with so many things, we are paying lip service. You know, we've got all the right policies. We've just set up a commission on climate change. In recognition, we've just created a new ministry of water. But we should be at 200% the speed that we're going at the moment in our response. I don't think that there are climate adaptation strategies in most of our cities, in most of our towns. Civil society and academia in this country, who have been banging this drum, is not being listened to. For example, almost a year ago, something called the Climate Justice Movement in South Africa presented a climate justice charter to Parliament, indicating many of the types of reforms and changes that we need to make urgently. A year later, nothing has been done. That charter has not been adopted. So I fear that we are leaving it too late, as usual. And once again, as we've seen with COVID-19, the people who are going to bear the brunt of the devastation are going to be poor people in this country, who are going to have their aspirations and their rights set back even further by drought, by heating, by famine, and so on. Everybody in this country should now be making this a political issue. And I'd almost say the number one political issue that faces our country.
It's interesting, Mark, because we know that climate change was probably the number one issue that globally, in many ways, before the pandemic hit, and then the pandemic became the focus. But there's some similarities in the way
Yes.
people initially denied that COVID-19 was anything more dangerous than flu. Even Donald Trump was sort of saying, oh, it'll all be over by April last year. It's almost like it's human nature to deny that things can change. And I wonder if we're not falling into the same trap around what we're seeing with our environment. It's always been okay, so we presume things will be the same. Do you think that maybe humanity can learn a lesson from the pandemic and how it forced us all to change? Perhaps we can use that to apply to changing behaviour around what's going on with our climate.
Absolutely, Sally. I mean, we should learn so many lessons from COVID-19. Certainly there is active denialism. There are groups who are trying to spread the idea that climate crisis doesn't exist, that it's not to do with human behavior and human economies. And then there are big profit-making industries, the fossil fuel industry in particular, that is just not willing to surrender its profitability, even if it's the interests of the planet that are at stake, and which, as happened in the past, for example, with big tobacco or big alcohol, support and fund think tanks that exist only to cast doubt on the science. That's why, again, effective public education accessible to everybody, driven by government, supported by science in our country, is just so critical. But I would also say, Sally, that one thing we should learn, and this may sound contradictory coming from me as I'm banging and sounding an alarm and perhaps making people fearful, but we have learned from COVID, from HIV before it, that fear alone doesn't drive change. And again, that's why the argument that I'm trying to put across to people in this article that I've written is, if you love your children, if you joy in your children, if you want happiness for your children in the 2030s and the 2040s and the 2050s, if you want to have children, if you're young, you need to be acting on these things now for positive reasons, because it is your future that is being threatened by inaction. So let's find the positive reasons to tackle this existential threat that we face.
It's such an important message, and I loved your article, Mark. You're quite right that when faced with this fearful reality, we mustn't go into denial, but seek what we can do and then be inspired by our children. And often, in fact, it is our children who are telling us what to do around climate change. But you're right, we have to take action, and we have to take it now, and it's not too late. There's still plenty that can be done. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. That is the editor of the Maverick Citizen, Mark Heywood.